And we all know that not everything that we think is bad posture is bad posture. It's really only bad posture if you don't change your posture. So the best posture, I don't know, I think it was it Kevin Darby said, the best posture is the one you're changing to. So change your posture every few minutes. So typically with this one, we'll see tightness and weakness. So there'll be tightness in the upper traps and levator scap, and that crosses with tightness in the pecs. And there'll be weakness in the deep cervical flexors, and that's crossed with weakness in the rhomboids and the lower traps, and sometimes the serratus anterior as well. And as we know that the muscle imbalances can lead to joint damage followed by inflammation and pain. And in this case, it'll be in the neck and back. And typically the weak muscles get weaker, the tight muscles get tighter, and that leads to a movement dysfunction, decreasing range of motion, increasing injury, especially if this person maintains that type of posture and a sedentary lifestyle. And so they may end up complaining of neck stiffness, headaches, sore upper back, and tension in the shoulders. So what do we see in our assessment? Typically, you'll see a forward head posture, and we had one presentation on that, but that'll be done on a Wednesday now when Julio is available. Increased cervical lordosis, increased thoracic kyphosis, and elevated or protracted shoulders, or elevated and protracted, sorry. Probably see reduced range of motion, especially shoulder flexion, abduction, and external rotation. The arms and head will likely fall forward, and the elbows could bend during an overhead squat, and you might see scapular winging during the push-up. So what's really going on here? Well, the glenohumeral joint has become less stable and more internally rotated, and it's this internal rotation that gives some susceptibility to a shoulder impingement. The client may have neck pain or rotator cuff tendonitis, and the scapular thoracic joint has become less stable as well, and that may have, well, when it does happen, yeah, that'll affect the thoracic spine mobility. So when you're working with a client like this, as we talked about in an earlier presentation, we should avoid overhead shoulder work like a shoulder press or a lat pull down until the flexion range of motion improves. And when you think about it, if we're getting someone to do an overhead press and this is their overhead press, then you may find that the pecs are starting to get involved and they're already tight. So we're making a problem worse. Plus, you're not going to be using the lateral deltoids the way you thought you were exercising this client. Same sort of thing with the shoulder abduction. So any type of upright row, suggest reducing the range of motion until the range of motion improves. If you're going to do lateral shoulder raises, I suggest using thumbs up, because if you look at it from the front, the shoulder is internally rotated, and now it's starting to externally rotate. So we're giving the subacromial space a little bit more. So if the person already is shoulders forward and you externally rotate a little bit, the chances of causing an impingement are much, much less. Plus, watch when they do a lateral raise. Their lateral raise is going to look like this. You see how my arms are in front of my body. So you're going to have to cue them to squeeze shoulder blades. For the upper body exercises, excuse me, avoid pronated or overhand grip, because again, this is now going to internally rotate the shoulder. So caution is advised with closed chain upper body exercises. Reduce the load, watch for dysfunctional movement, cue the fix, and adjust the program accordingly. Watch for the shoulders rising and the head coming forward in upper body pulling and pushing exercises. So you may see them as they start to pull, how the shoulders start to elevate, and well, we'll get to cues in a minute. You may watch for one or both shoulders excessively winging in a pushing exercise, especially closed chain exercise. And watch for the elbows and shoulder moving in unison in a pulling exercise. Typically, someone who is shoulders forward is going to do their row like this. Now you notice my shoulders didn't move, which means I haven't engaged the upper back at all. So when you're watching from the side, you may have to cue them to bring their shoulders back and elbows back at the same time. So some of the other cues, well, we always say shoulders back and down, but I'm not sure a lot of clients appreciate what back and down means. So I saw Fraser Quelch do in a lecture, and he taught about bend the bar. And this was just, it's so fantastic. So let's say I've got a handle from a band in each hand here, and I say bend the bar. What's going to happen? Guess what? The shoulders go back and down. So to me, it's just a lot easier to say bend the bar and the shoulders go where they're supposed to be. When the shoulders elevate, I talk about an anti-shrug with my clients. So I'll get them to pull it down. And these may be the same sorts of person who's going to have headaches because they're always using their upper traps. They're firing all day. So they're eventually just going to get short and tight. So there's another cue you can use. So besides the anti-shrug, let's say you've got an orange in each armpit and you say squeeze the oranges. So that's going to bring the shoulders back down. Oh, I forgot to mention there's a clearing exam for a shoulder impingement. So if you want to just check a client, get them to hold on to the opposite shoulder and see if they can move the elbow up and down. If they can without pain, then that's a very, very quick clearing test for shoulder impingement. It's quick and it's well within our practice. So corrective strategies for this type of client, there's two columns there. One is for the overactive short tight muscles, and the other is for the underactive lengthened and weak muscles. So looking at the overactive short tight, we want to relax them. We want to relax those muscles or inhibit them. So we can do some things during the warm-up. We can do dynamic stretches. We can do foam rolling and things like that. Chin tucks are awesome for that. The snow angels, either lying or down or doing them on a wall. Horizontal shoulder abductions are also great, but just make sure the thumbs are up. So we've got the shoulder a little more externally rotated than normal. The static stretches at the end of the session, you might even add some PNF to reinforce the new range of motion that you're giving this person. And the brain needs to understand that there is new range of motion, and you can do that through PNF, which is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. I don't know who comes up with these things, but it's a crazy word sometimes. On the other side, we have some underactive, lengthened and weak muscles. For those, we need to activate them during the warm-up, because otherwise they might not fire. So prone scapular retractions, again, full can. If the client can get down on the floor and you can do it prone, just make sure that the thumbs are up. You can also do it from a hip hinge position. Not as good. Prone is the best. External shoulder rotations, lateral raises, full can. Seated neck flexion, isometric. I love giving this to some clients and get them to do it at a red light, you know, when they're driving. So with the chin properly tucked, because you want to reinforce proper posture. So once you get the chin tucked, you can put the hand on the forehead and just push against the forehead for maybe 10 seconds at a time, release, and then go for another 10 seconds until the light changes to green, and then we go again. But this really works the deep cervical flexor as well, and also the superficial ones, but it's the deep ones that we're really targeting in this case. And for the actual workout, you'll of course want to do more work for these muscles because they're already underactive and they're weak. So for these ones, more work for these muscles and less work for the antagonists. Okay, so that's it for upper cross. Any questions or move on to lower cross?
That was good. In terms of ladder raises, and also like they have these shoulder flipping. It's not ideal to do bicep extension under that.
Yeah.
Like while you're doing body weight one, they put too much the shoulder on the rotation side. And do it if you want to. I go use that as a
Okay, good.
And always avoid the long lever exercise for the shoulder
Yes.
because patient have for geriatric patient, geriatric patient have a less. There is a muscle which name is the supraspinal, which is in between the acromion and the humerus.
Mhm.
So at that time, when we do the abduction in same way, fully external, fully internal, or the neutral. So at that time, they pinch in between the two bones.
Yeah.
So always do the start with the short lever.
Yeah.
Do same.
Good point. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to lower cross, and this is a very common compensatory pattern, and it's really come about because of a sedentary lifestyle. So what's going on here is we have tightness in the hip flexor complex and the adductors crossed with tightness in the erector spinae and the lats. So the weakness in the abdominals, the internal obliques and the transverse abdominis crossed with weakness in the glute max and the glute medius. You may find in this type of a client too that the gastrocs and the soleus are also tight. And just like before, weak muscles get weaker, tight muscles get tighter, and it leads to a movement dysfunction, decreasing range of motion, and increasing risk of injury. This type of client could see pain and discomfort in the low back, the hips, and the hamstrings. When you look at the diagram on the left, you can see that because the abdominals are weak and the hip flexor complex is relatively stronger, it's now starting to pull the entire yes, other way. Sorry, iPad. It's starting to pull things into. No, I was right the first time. Yeah, I was right the first time. And anterior pelvic tilt. So that's where we typically see. So during our assessment, where we could see increased lumbar lordosis, we could see anterior pelvic tilt. During the sit and reach test, we see reduced, we see the sit and reach test itself might show shortness, but that shortness could be anywhere in the posterior chain. And with this type of a client, typically it's going to be the erector spinae and the gastrocs in the posterior chain that's causing the problem, and less likely to be the hamstrings. If they feel tightness in the hamstrings, it's likely the hamstrings are our victim. They're being stretched, they're being pulled up, and they're being pulled down. So you might also see reduced hip extension and reduced hip abduction in the range of motion. During the squat, you could see increased arching of the low back and forward lean during the descent. You might also see knee valgus. During the push-up, you're likely to see increased low back arching, and again, the hip is dropping to the floor because this client has decreased lumbopelvic stability. And you may also see increased thoracic kyphosis and cervical lordosis, just because the upper body is adapting to what's happening in the lower body. So you may see a client with both upper and lower cross. So with this type of client, suggest watching for the knee valgus in the squats. And if you do see it, then as we saw in an earlier session, you can use the reactive neuromuscular training. You can use cueing as well. Now, if they also have the knee valgus and they're symptomatic with running, although I don't know how many of our clients are going to be still running. But if they are, I'd really suggest reducing their running volume. And I'd suggest avoiding lunges until the form improves with the squat. So once the squat improves, then start moving on and making it a little more dynamic. Watch for the hip dropping and the back arching in the planks and push-ups. For the hip drops, you could cue raise the hips. If the back is arching, you can cue tighten the abs. Watch for knee bending in the hip extension exercises. I've seen clients who, when I've got a band around their ankle and I'm getting them to do a hip extension, and they know that their leg isn't going back as far as they would like it to do. So guess what? They bend the knee. So now the band is going back a little bit further. So their body is adapting to something that it knows is not quite right. So you need to watch for that and make sure the leg stays straight on that. Watch for the low back on the floor in supine exercises. You can prop the low back or you can cue the brace. Corrective strategies, just like before, we have overactive short and tight, and we have underactive long and weak. Same sort of a thing, relax and inhibit the overactive, and more static stretches at the end of the session. And you can add PNF to reinforce the neuromuscular control. For the underactive, lengthened and weak, again, these you want to activate during the warm-up. Lots of great exercises. We probably have our clients doing a lot of supine glute bridges. You can add a pause up at the top, so a positional isometric. Sideline clams. You can do dead bugs, but cue the posterior pelvic tilt. And the same with a plank. You can cue the posterior pelvic tilt just to try and get their body to go somewhere between what they're used to and where you're trying to move them to. Torso rotations, and that's for the T-spine, the last one. So again, the same sort of thing. When you do your program for these clients, you want to make sure you're doing more work for these muscles and less work for the antagonists.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
How do you usually choose someone who's an anterior tilt? I mean, how far do you tell them to go? Because usually you say, okay, that's go forward, right? So then they go all the way forward into the posterior tilt,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of like tricky to someone that neutral spine is standing up. When I keep people neutral spine lies down on their back, like in supine position, would be one leg up, one leg down, and that automatically do supine.
Yeah.
But like, how do you keep someone when they're in like, a burned out position, like hands and knees per se? So I mean, in the past, what I've been told, and what I do is just by engaging the floor, that puts you into neutral spine, or pulling your navel up and in.
Yeah, and that's a good way of doing it. You can also, if they're in a plank, you can put a dowel on and get them to push up against the dowel. On the ground, same sort of thing. You can get them to push the low back into the ground and then back up and down again, or you can do it as a cat-cow to get them used to doing this followed by this, and then say, okay, stop where you think is in between.
I see, just doing like pelvic tilt.
Yeah, just doing the pelvic tilt on the floor to get them to feel the two extremes.
Yeah.
And then try and get them to find something in between.
Yeah.
And if you don't think it's in between, you can cue it. Oh, I need a little bit more in that
It's true,
direction.
because it's a small movement, so finding
Yeah.
the in between is challenging.
Yeah, and the same with the cat-cow. You can get them to do the cat-cow and say, okay, now stop when you think you have a neutral spine. You can put the dowel on, double check, and then get them to tighten up the abs a little bit more.
Yeah, I know one thing I just wanted to share with everyone is what I found really worked, is putting people on their back and having them leg up, one leg down, one leg bent and one leg straight, and then just kind of putting their hands where their low back and core is to feel what neutral spine is, so that they can then somewhat get a sense of what that's like when they're sitting down or standing up.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And I've done the same sort of thing and then asked them how much pressure they feel on their hand.
Yeah.
And if they feel like they're crushing their hand, then, maybe I'll roll up my hoodie and jam it underneath a little bit until they can rebuild the core a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we'll try with the hand again. Now, some can't get their hand, in which case you're looking at propping.
Yeah,
the
it
low
is
back.
something that you can't really look in the mirror at, like you really have to feel it.
Yeah. Okay.
Also, you can add it, if you want to do proper static posture build, then you can do both your buttock, squeeze your buttock with that static. It's a straight way to directly in.
That's right, you're absolutely right. Or I would pushing the
Yeah, that's a good point, Rahul. So that's where, when you're doing the supine glute raise or hip lift, and you get them to do the positional isometric up at the top of the movement. And you can, get them to hold for 3, 4, or 5 seconds and really squeeze those glutes. So they can see how far they can actually go up. Okay, good points. All right. So key takeaways from this one: always do the best assessment you can. Whenever you see a postural issue, identify the short and tight weak muscle, short and tight muscles. The opposing muscles are likely underactive and weak. And now, if you see this gives you your strategy. Let's say this is a client who's having problems walking for long distance. You can now see that in the assessment. You can now tie what your assessment is to their goal. So if you can link this issue, any postural issue, to a motivating goal for a client, you're going to have them fixed up in no time. For the short and tight muscle, it's always the same thing. Relax and inhibit through myofascial release or dynamic stretching during the warm-up, and longer static stretches at the end. For the underactive and weak, activate it during the warm-up, and then give it more work to do than the opposing muscles. Monitor the improvement in movement and coordination, and with any luck, you'll also see them moving closer towards their own goals. Okay, questions? No? Yes.
I want to add one more thing with upper and lower cross syndrome. So another thing, it seems like a scoliosis. You can see probably see the one shoulder is high and another shoulder is shallow. So it is the same like upper and lower cross syndrome. Always you can more straight on the concave part of the scoliosis. Like spine always are in a C shape or in the S. But most probably patient with all the other it has like they have C-shaped scoliosis. Always straight on the concave part and always straight on the convex part.
Yeah, that's great. And typically what you'll end up doing is a lot of unilateral work with that type of client, because they'll need strengthening on one side and they'll need lengthening on the other. So exactly the same approach. Yeah.
Yeah, that is most concave has happened because of diagnosis.
Yeah.
Convex is too much, it's way too stretched, so we got to strengthen, make the muscles shorter, and then.
Yeah. Now, if it's a congenital scoliosis, then that's a different bottle of wax. But if it's functional, and that means postural or mechanical, then we can intervene and we can be helpful in that case. Okay, thank you very much, guys. All right, we're now ready for clients who have osteoarthritis.